In the early 20th century, Russia as a nation was in an absolutely terrible state. Whereas the rest of Europe was industrializing, modernizing, and overall just generally advancing, Russia was seemingly stuck in a paralysis. Living conditions were grim, food was scarce, and the Russian people as a whole were generally incredibly unhappy. Especially with their monarchy, who seemed to do everything they possibly could to not address their desires, inevitably leading to much chaos, conflict, and reforms, but pretty much none of which, however, would ultimately lower tensions. To make matters worse, in 1914, World War I would begin, which, at the time, was the largest war that humanity had ever seen, of which Russia would be dragged into. However, because the nation was already in such a poor state, its soldiers were terribly equipped to fight their much more prepared rivals, such as Germany. As such, when the thousands of Russian soldiers were drafted to fight, many of which came from the peasant classes, it ultimately resulted in a gargantuan loss of life, which naturally only sparked more tension at home as the participation in the war became increasingly unpopular. The 6-year period between 1917 to 1923 was specifically a very tumultuous one for Russia, as during this time there was a massive power struggle that erupted into an outright civil war between two competing forces. On the one hand, you had the White Army, composed of a myriad of traditionalists, conservatives, and monarchists who wished to keep things as they were. And on the other hand, you had the Red Army, who wished to usher in a new communist regime that would represent the peasants of the nation. In the end, the White Army would be defeated, and the Red Army would triumph, overall resulting in the subsequent creation of an entirely new state under an entirely new ideology: the Soviet Union under Communism. This new nation had the officially stated aim of ending the consolidation of power amongst the bourgeoisie elite by enforcing a new communist society that put the proletariat workers at the forefront of governance, working for the benefit of the national collective at large, rather than a handful of privileged individuals at the top. In the years that followed its founding, the Soviet administration would go on to transform its society via totalitarian means, taking control of almost every aspect of its citizens' lives, from the economy, the education system, and even the media itself, resulting in a people with one unified mission: to maintain and help spread communism, not just domestically, but also worldwide. In the aftermath of World War II, whereby the Soviet Union would claim its victory over Nazi Germany and subsequently expand its sphere of influence across much of Eastern Europe, the state would truly solidify itself as a well-respected, if not feared, superpower, rivaling even that of the United States. 50 years after the Russian Revolution, in 1967, and the Soviet Union was on top of the world. Soviet citizens were thus encouraged to celebrate the anniversary of the events that ultimately led to their nation's founding. Part of these celebrations was the creation of time capsules, whereby citizens would write letters detailing their lives at the time and their expectations for the future. These letters were then to be buried, only to be opened 50 more years later, in the year 2017. 2017, much like 1967, of course being a very important year for the Soviet Union, as it would then be 100 years since the revolution of 1917, and thus marking a century since the events that subsequently led to the creation of their state. Of course, there was just one problem, however. The Soviet Union didn't last until 2017, disbanding officially on Christmas Day in 1991. This meant that when 2017 actually came around, the opening of such time capsules from 1967 was somewhat bittersweet, as the messaging within such capsules would paint a very different expected future than the one that actually happened. Today, I'm going to be reading you some of these letters and analysing what we can learn from them. In the northwestern Arctic port city of Arkhangelsk, a time capsule letter was produced by the Communist Party's youth organization. The first half details their current goals, such as the efforts put into improving the living conditions of their region during 1967. The second half of the letter was a message dedicated to the readers of the future, 50 years later, in 2017. The youth of our region is gifting you, the young ones of the 21st century, by turning our small villages into modern towns. We built on land that used to be swamps, and created the colossal wood industry of the north, the Arkhangelsk factories. You won't have to see the wooden blocks and sidewalks, for our generation today is transforming the city. All of Arkhangelsk is building vibrantly, and we are always on its scaffolding. We know that you will have better lives than us. You will do great things in our galaxy, and will make our planet great. We are a little jealous of all of you who are celebrating the centenary of our Soviet motherland. But we also know that you will be a little jealous of our restless young generation. We have a clear aim, a great future ahead of us, and lots of things to accomplish. We have things that we can invest our hearts, brains, energy, and labour in, and this is the source of our happiness. While this letter is certainly heartwarming and optimistic, it's also rather bittersweet. Putting aside the obvious, the centenary of the Soviet motherland would of course never happen. But what's even worse is that today, Arkhangelsk, far from being booming, is actually undergoing a massive population decline. From 348,000 people in 2010 to 301,000 people in 2021, which is, ironically, about the same amount of people who lived in the city when this letter was written in the 1960s. A very grim picture that paints a massive disparity from the optimistic future predicted just 50 years ago. But by far the most disappointing aspect of this letter was the comments about space exploration, of which the people of Arkhangelsk weren't alone in believing. In Novosibirsk, the largest city in Siberia, the local party committee wrote a 3-page letter that would paint a very optimistic future. Dear descendants, today you are celebrating a unique day, 100 years of Soviet rule. We know our time is interesting, but we're sure that yours is much more so. We are building communism, and you are living in it. We believe that you have perfectly equipped our blue planet, colonized the moon, landed on Mars, and that you are continuing the exploration of outer space that we, the people of the first 50 years, have begun. With your ship sailing, we believe that you are holding talks about scientific and cultural collaborations with representatives of other galaxies and alien civilizations, and that the work that our fathers and grandfathers started 50 years ago, you will finish and bring to victory. Space exploration was seen as an integral indicator of human progress in Soviet society, and thus, such sci-fi visions of the future were seen as an inevitable expectancy. The nation may have been officially atheistic, but that didn't stop cosmonauts from being borderline worshipped, with Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, being a prime example, often being paraded around in propaganda as living proof of the power of communism, pushing humanity ever forwards. The Red Army Choir even had a tune called I Believe My Friends, which was all about space exploration, with lyrics such as, I believe, friends, that rocket caravans will rush us forwards from star to star. On the dusty paths of distant planets, our footprints will remain. Of course, these grand declarations of galactic exploration and meeting alien civilizations, though certainly lofty in ambition, seem almost absurd by today's standards, as not only has man truly yet to meet alien life, but we haven't even still touched down on the red planet of the future. Needless to say then, that the red country of the past would be more than disappointed at our progress in space, or perhaps more, the lack of. Within the Soviet Union, communism was truly seen at the time as not just a means to collectivize, but the very symbol of human progress itself. Scientific, futuristic, and inevitable. With the time capsule found in the southwestern Republic of Adygea, showing this strong belief like nothing better. Regarding the upcoming 50th anniversary, we are confident that it will bring the decisive victory of progressive mankind in its struggle against a sworn enemy of all peoples, imperialism. Armed with the Marxist-Leninist theory, with the power of scientific foresight, we know that communism will be built. Let the 21st century be the century of the triumph of communism throughout the planet. When this letter was written in 1967, there was only 15 widely recognized communist countries on Earth. 50 years later in 2017, however, and this number had decreased to just 5, of which, even then, many are essentially so in name only. A far stretch from the optimistic future of global conquest that seemed only inevitable to the enlightened Soviet citizen. It should be noted that Russia, of course, was not the only part of the Soviet Union. In the Moldovan city of Tiraspol, a similar time capsule was found, of which details an almost superhuman-like future of unbelievable proportions. Dear comrades descendants, we, the labourers of the 20th century, are writing to you. Tell your children and grandchildren how we struggled for your right to immortality. We lived in heroic times, when great discoveries were made, when the world was shaken by revolutions and wars burned the planet. You, however, have probably already eliminated all harmful bacteria, viruses, and live without aging or sickness. But know that it was us who helped you in this, when we discovered the mysteries of cancer and overcame the barrier of tissue incompatibility. Putting aside the very optimistic medical innovations that obviously haven't come to fruition, what's more noteworthy is the unbelievable situation of Tiraspol and Moldova at large in the present. As today, Moldova is a nation split, seemingly in two, with an unrecognized breakaway state known as Transnistria, claiming independence from Moldova, of which Tiraspol is declared as its capital. Sadly, far from being immortal, the mortality rate of Transnistria has boomed in recent years, whereby in tandem, the population has plunged by 35%. A nation not just broken, but dying. One cannot help but think how horrified such optimists would be if they saw how different the future they desired is, compared to the one that they would get. But this last time capsule letter is by far the most chilling of them all, which reads, "You've never had to chant shame on the aggressors. You've never had to protest criminal wars. You've never had to read news about provocations. How far away these events are from you. Young crowd of 2017, we are sure that you have justified the trust your heroic predecessors have invested in you, that you have created a new world. A new world, assumedly without war. A world where communism would reign supreme. A world where humanity focused away from such petty conflicts into peacefully cooperating for the betterment of mankind." The irony, however, is that this last time capsule letter was found buried, of all places, in Ukraine, which is, at the time of recording, one of the world's most notorious war zones, and has been for years. Well, they were depressing. If you want to see more time capsule letters, I'll be posting some on my Twitter after this production goes live. But I'm showing you these letters because I truly believe that the communists of the past can tell us much about the progressives of the present, and that there's lessons to be learned from these letters that can be applied to today. We have to keep in mind that the Soviet Union was ultimately a totalitarian regime. Resistance against the status quo doctrine was not tolerated, and so it's hard to determine just how much of these time capsule letters are genuine belief or just propagandistic spiel. Either way, however, forced or otherwise, no one can say that the communists didn't have a very clear vision in mind for mankind. As forwards, the future was always their focus. The progressives of today, who often view themselves as the left-wing inheritors of a post-communist world, are also, actually, orientated towards the future, with the first clue being in their name: progress. As progress implies a status quo, a goal, and the movement towards moving the status quo closer to such a goal. However, the difference between the communists of the past and the progressives of the present is that the ultimate goals of the progressives are remarkably unclear. Communist ideology, as stated earlier, was summarized very succinctly in the Communist Manifesto, a short read by almost any metric that went in depth about ushering in a world free of the bourgeoisie elites in order to empower the proletariat masses. Progressive ideology, however, has no unifying manifesto at all. On the contrary, it's almost impossible to concretely define, as it constantly warps its values and what is considered acceptable or unacceptable on an almost day-by-day basis. A decade ago, they claimed to wish to empower women, yet today they say women don't exist. A decade ago, they claimed people should be colorblind to race, yet today, they say race is something that must be constantly discussed. Progressivism seems to have almost no concrete values of any kind whatsoever, promising a false utopian collective future based on nothing in order to justify such selfish behavior and give it a reason to exist. It rejects the best aspects of communism, such as its ambitious desires, but retains its worst aspects, such as its naive idealism. And that's a very important point. You have two outlooks on life: pragmatism and idealism. Pragmatism meaning to see the world for how it actually is, and thus responding to it in a way that seems realistic, and idealism meaning to see the world for how it should be, and trying to warp it around such an ideal. One should really want to be in the middle, being grounded in reality while also having grand ambitions. But on this scale, there's no doubt that communism, as an ideology, rather than being balanced, was fanatically idealistic, trying to reinvent humanity from the ground up. Yet likewise, progressivism, despite, as we've already established, not having an actual concrete ideal at all, is almost like a brother to communism in this regard. Communists and progressives are both fanatically idealistic. For rather than seeing the world for how it is, they simply demand the world should be a certain way, and try to bend society around such desires. They aren't pragmatic, they aren't understanding, and they aren't realistic. They both see themselves as the inevitable inheritors of the future, whereby everyone else is merely living in the past and must catch up to their unrivaled genius ideas. The communists believed if only the capitalists were gone, then communism would reign supreme and usher in a new utopia. And likewise, the progressives now believe that if only the conservatives were gone, then progressivism would reign supreme and usher in yet another new utopia. Everything about these ideologies states that it's okay if the present is poor, as it's the future that matters, and that, so long as the ideology is followed, is inevitably going to be rich. Yet of course, as shown in the case of the time capsule letters, via the shocking differences in the utopian estimations of the future, and the often dystopian realities of the present, being certain of the future, when based not on human nature, but a man-made ideology, often proves to be a foolish endeavour. Again, it's hard to estimate what the utopian future the progressives believe they are ushering in actually looks like, as, being nothing more than an emotional illusion, it's not even sure they even know themselves. But whatever it is, it's almost guaranteed not to come to fruition, but on the contrary, perhaps the opposite. I understand that there's a certain irony in predicting the future, especially when I've spent all this production harping on about people who predicted it very, very wrongly. But there's a difference between idealistically deluding yourself and observing tangible trends. If there's one thing that the progressives of the present need to learn from communism, it's that no matter how great you think your ideology is, you will never conquer human nature without first destroying what it means to be human itself. For if your ideas are fundamentally incompatible with human nature, then you can only keep them reined in via censorship, control, and totalitarianism. Which is exactly what progressives try to do. Yet mark my words, such ideas, far from being realised, will be completely and utterly destroyed. Communism died with a whimper due to administrative failure, but it still had many followers during its demise, and even still does to this day. Because, in spite of its blatant failures, it was at least a noble attempt at improving the state of humanity. Yet I believe progressivism will not perish via a whimper, but a storm the likes of which will make history tremble, for it doesn't really try to improve anything. Progressives, whatever they may think of themselves, factually are making Western society worse in almost every way. And yet they somehow believe that they are the good guys because they've deluded themselves to think as such. No. Study history and see what happens to societies with trends like the ones progressivism is creating. Because as it turns out, when you demonize every young man in existence, set groups against each other based on identity, purposefully bankrupt your poorest people, ignore rising rates of crime, and try to silence anyone who complains about such, then as it turns out, people don't just get in a field and start singing. On the contrary, they go absolutely berserk and demand immediate change. Progressives should take a moment to step back and ask themselves whether they're living in an out-of-touch dream, which will soon blossom into a very in-touch nightmare. For I believe, for those who do not come to such a realization, and very quickly, then their ideology may well soon find itself in a time capsule of its own. To the opponents of progressivism, of which there are many and increasingly so, the advice to follow is rather clear. The progressives' biggest weakness is this belief that their worldview is inevitable, and it is this that must be taken advantage of. So let them believe that they are the future, for when the real future actually arrives, they will be caught in a great surprise. Allah came at them where they never expected, and threw terror into their hearts. They wrecked their homes with their own hands, and by the hands of the believers. Therefore, take a lesson, O you who have insight. Let's see where your progress gets you, shall we? Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that. Communism and progressivism are certainly very different in terms of belief, especially how concrete those beliefs are. However, there's no doubt that they're both very idealistic in nature and very future, forward-driven and utopian, almost by design. I think in spite of those differences, it really tells us a lot about the inevitable fate of progressivism. And I really think that progressives should take note because, it's one thing to want an idea to be true, whatever that idea is, however vague it is, but it's another thing to actually implement that idea into reality. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on this sort of bizarre, blind utopianism. I'll definitely be reading the comments and seeing what you have to say as ever. If you want to see more time capsule letters that didn't quite make the cut for this production, I'll be posting some more on my Twitter later. Twitter, by the way, rapidly becoming my favourite website on the internet, just simply absolutely fantastic. But nevertheless, as ever, I'd like to thank the Wall of Famers on Patreon who keep this channel ad-free. Yes, I'm able to enable advertisements on this channel, but I choose not to, because I don't like advertisements. I don't like being interrupted. I don't like being associated with companies that I didn't choose to. Call it stupid, call it lame, and it probably is, but I would much rather be funded by people who watch the productions and actually enjoy them, so every patron is more than appreciated. Nevertheless, folks, I'll see you next time.